Hello, welcome to Edrei Lael Apologetica podcast. This is Edrei, and my intention here is to defend the Christian faith. Today, I'm honored to receive here Dr. John Walton and with my friend Carlos Xavier.
Hello, Edrei. Hello, Professor Walton. Thank you very much. I'm here also. This video is going to be in Teldidata's, my channel. Edrei and I have already settled this. And I'm here. I am a pastor, a Baptist pastor, and I'm also a lawyer. I have master degrees in law here in Brazil, but I am making my PhD in philosophy. I also have a theology BA here in Brazil, and we are we admire very much Professor Walton work, and it's really a pleasure and an honor be able to make this interview here. So, Professor Walton, thank you very much.
Well, it's very much my delight and my privilege to be on and to chat with you about these important issues.
Yeah, so
Okay.
let me present here too. I'm Edrei, as I said earlier. I'm a pastor and lawyer and apologist here in Brazil. And today we have the honor to receive here Dr. John Walton. Um, so it's a really pleasure to be here with you. And tell us more about you, your work, and what are your most recent research interests? In which questions have you been working lately, and so on. Please, Dr. John Walton.
Sure. So I'm a recently retired professor of Old Testament at Wheaton College, and as you can see in my background, they let me keep my office. So I'm still here every day working on research and writing. My most recent projects that have been published, one is a commentary on the book of Daniel. This is volume one, which is just chapters 1 through 6. A lot of ancient Near Eastern background went into this and is detailed in those pages. So I've spent the last 8 years doing this. Volume two, which is the rest of the book of Daniel, chapters 7 through 12, is currently in indexing and will be out in November. So that's been one of the big projects. Another book that I recently published is called New Explorations in the Lost World of Genesis. And I hope that'll be translated into Portuguese before too long. And
Yes.
it basically updates the conversation from the previous Lost World books. It's not a revised edition. It just says, well, I've learned something in the last 10, 15 years, and I'd like to share that with you. This book also has about 60 FAQs, questions that people ask, either reviewers or when I'm in person giving presentations or on podcasts. What are the questions people ask? And this has a lot of answers to those questions. So those are a couple of the things I've been doing recently.
Oh, that's so nice, Professor Walton. We're excited to see all these books translated to Portuguese. We hope this can happen soon. Uh, and I'm happy to see that you have had published this commentary on Daniel. Last week I preached about Daniel 9, uh,
Ah,
Daniel's prayer of repentance.
ah, so you
So
preached so you preached about the prayer, not the 70 weeks prophecy.
yeah, not about the seven. But I'm not a dispensationalist at all.
Uh-huh,
So,
uh-huh. Yeah.
but it was about the prayer, verse one and follow. But that's so interesting, and I'd like to ask you. Uh, how important is for a Bible student to understand the relationship between the Old Testament and ancient Near Eastern culture? How they interact? The latest book you show that about the lost world of Genesis. It's all about that. But how important is this, and how the Old Testament and the ancient Near Eastern culture interact? Can you say about a little about that for us, please?
Sure. You know, culture is a silent partner in every conversation we have. There are things that we assume that our audience knows, and that's based on a shared culture. If we don't have a shared culture, we recognize that there are things that we need to explain more because someone in our same culture won't understand. So we understand that insider to insider conversation is going to be different than insider and outsider conversations. So what we have in the Bible is insider to insider communication. And of course, we come to it as outsiders. So the question is, how can we enter that circle of communication between these insiders? To do that, we have to try to understand the culture of the ancient world. Certainly the culture of Israel, primarily, but Israel, of course, is within this ancient world. And therefore, the culture of the ancient world can help us. We don't expect Babylonian or Egyptian culture to be exactly the same as Israelite culture. But we do realize that Babylonian and Egyptian cultures are closer to Israel than we are. And so, if we want to understand that cultural backdrop of the ancient world, we can use the literature of the Babylonians and the Egyptians and Assyrians and Hittites, all to try to understand that world a little better. One of the ways I like to talk about this is that we all carry around cultural backpacks. That is, we've got the ideas that we recognize in our culture. For instance, if I had a backpack on it that said creation, and it had all my cultural ideas about creation. And I could unpack that and I would find all kinds of things. For me, it would have some of the biblical material, but it would also have a lot of science in it, and even science that I may or may not agree with. Just these are the things in our culture. And so all of those things would be in my backpack, and all of those influence how I think about creation. Well, the Israelites also had a backpack that said creation on it, so to speak. But if we look in their backpack, it's not going to have any of the things that are in my backpack that have to do with science. It's going to have things that have more to do with what Babylonians and Egyptians would also have in their backpacks. That doesn't mean that the Israelites accepted the mythology or the gods of the Babylonians, but they think about the world very similar to the way that the Babylonians or Egyptians would have. So that's why it's important for us to understand the ancient Near East. Ancient Near Eastern literature gives us windows into the world of ancient Israel, the world in which they lived. It gives us a little glimpse into a standard sort of backpack that they would have had on any number of different topics in the ancient world. And so, in that sense, that's not so much describing an interaction, but it's describing this overlap, these common ideas. In terms of interaction, we have to recognize that any literature anywhere in the world and throughout time is interacting with the literature and the ideas of its day. That's what you do. The Israelites were very familiar with the literature of ancient Egypt and ancient Babylon, and they're interacting with it because they have a different perspective in many cases, but still their perspectives are reflections of that interaction. Sometimes they're presenting alternate ideas. Sometimes they're even subverting the ideas in the ancient world. But even when they're doing that, they are interacting with them. And therefore, the more we can understand the ancient world, the more we can understand sort of the conversation that is going on between insiders in that world. So that's just a little bit of some of the ideas.
Oh, very good. You said overlap is perhaps a more accurate concept than interaction. That's very good. But thinking about this overlapping or interaction, what are the most significant influence and difference when we compare the Old Testament with ancient Near Eastern literature?
Well, of course, some of the most important ones are fairly obvious to anyone. The monotheism of Israel, their focus on Yahweh as their God, is something that's distinct. Of course, the rest of the world was polytheistic. And it should be noted that polytheism is not just a matter of the number of the gods. Polytheism has to do with the idea that gods act in community. In the ancient world, everyone believed that people found their identity in their community, not deep down inside them, but in their community. And likewise, then, for them to understand the identity of the gods, they wanted to understand how each god functioned and was situated in that community, the divine community. And they didn't think that they could understand a god's identity without understanding the God's role and status in the divine community. So it was very difficult for Israel to think about a God who had no divine community. How in the world could you know a God like that? And so it's very striking in the Old Testament, Israelite literature and theology, is that Yahweh says, I don't have a divine community. There are no other gods before me. You are my community, Israel, and I've chosen you. And that's quite a distinctive perspective that flavors everything they think about God and the relationship to him. That also is defined in the covenant. And the covenant between a God and a people group is not something we find in the rest of the ancient world. Yet it defines Israel as they think about their relationship with God. So those are some of the influences and differences that we find with ancient Near Eastern literature. Still, of course, they were interested in relationship with God. Everybody in the ancient world was. They wanted to be in relationship with God. They had different ideas about how that works. They were interested in divine presence. Anybody in the ancient world was. But again, they thought about it differently. I find it very intriguing, for instance, that when Yahweh gives Israel their sacrificial system, it looks very much like the sacrificial systems of anybody else in the ancient world. So he gives them something that's familiar feeling, that would have connected with them, that would have made sense to them. But even though he gives them very much the same kinds of rituals, he tells them, but don't think about it the same way that everybody else does. You're going to be doing the same things, but for different reasons. So Israel was not supposed to think that they were feeding the gods. They weren't supposed to think that God had needs that they were fulfilling through their rituals. So it's interesting that God chose to preserve this same kind of practice, yet to try to persuade them that they had to think differently. It's a great sort of snapshot, a photograph of this same but different that we see in many cases.
So thank you for this presentation. And let me say that I'm also excited to have those books of Daniel and Genesis in Portuguese, as we just have the Lost Worlds books in Portuguese, Os Mundos Perdidos, as we call in Portuguese. So take advantage of this point about how the people of that time viewed Bible issues, and in a specific way the Israel people. Let me talk about your in Book of Genesis, in Genesis 1 to 3, but more specifically in relation to garden, to trees, the serpent, and the colored fall. How these things are significant to Israel people and the relation of that with the ancient Near East literature.
Mm-hmm. So I've updated my views on some of these things and gone into them in more detail in the book that I already mentioned, the New Explorations. And so I'm drawing from that as I talk now. Some of those things differ a little bit from what I had in the lost world of Adam and Eve, but I'm growing and learning, and so that's kind of important for us all to do. In Genesis 3, we have to back up really. Genesis 1 is the idea that God created the world by bringing order. Then God made people in his image to be order bringers alongside of him. That is, he delegates a relationship where they'll both be working together to bring order in the world. And that's why you have, right after image of God, subdue and rule. An image bearer is an order bringer. And so we have that set up in Genesis 1. Then in Genesis 2, they're placed in the divine realm, the Garden of Eden, which I now see as more people in the divine realm instead of God in the human realm. But that's another issue. But there in this garden are represented in the trees divine prerogatives. God is the source of life, and God is the source of order. The tree of the knowledge of good and evil is a tree of order, a tree of wisdom, because wisdom is the pathway to order. And so here's the idea that God is the one who gives life, God is the one who is bringing order, and people are working under him. That's how it's supposed to be. What they do when they take from the tree is they exert their independence. They exert their autonomy. We want to do it ourselves. We want order focused on ourselves, with us as the center and us as the driving factor. And that defines humanity. Following up with the lost world of Adam and Eve, and even more strongly in the new book, the idea of Adam and Eve as archetypes is really important. Their names tell us. Their names are human and life. And they tell us then that these are representations of all of us. We are them. They are us. What they do, we do. And so in that sense, this reflects all of us every day, all the time, deciding we want to do order on our own for ourselves. Selfish, center-focused on us. And so that's how I see the trees. People choosing to be autonomous. And therefore, I'm not so inclined to label this the fall. That's not a biblical term, of course, neither in Old Testament nor New Testament. And it suggests a fall from something. And of course, theologically, it's a fall from grace. But that suggests that they were in a state of grace, which I don't see Genesis presenting at all. They're not in any sort of state of grace. And furthermore, chapter 3 never mentions the word sin or disobedience. And so I think that we've made something theologically out of it that, of course, we took some lead from Paul, who wanted to make something out of it for his conversation. And that's fine for Paul to do, by the way. But that's not what Genesis is doing. So I'm not inclined to think of Genesis as presenting the fall or kind of how sin began. It's rather how people embarked on this journey of wanting to do order on their own. And of course, it didn't work out so well. And so in Genesis 3:15, we've often read that as messianic and speaking of a victory and all of these things. But it doesn't mention a victory. It doesn't say who wins. It just says they're going to be hammering away at each other, which is what people chose for themselves when they said, we're going to do order ourselves. Now, of course, in the ancient Near East, it was the gods who fought chaos to bring order in creation. But Genesis 1 has nothing of that. Instead, God says, okay, you've chosen to do order on your own. You've got it. It's yours. And so there's going to be enmity between this threat to order and people trying to find order. And you're going to have to cope with that struggle. And there are going to be blows exchanged both ways, generation to generation, your seed, her seed. And this will characterize human life because this is the choice you made. And so chapter 3 sets up that struggle. And as we go from Genesis 3 through to Genesis 11, it talks about all of the different ways that people try to bring order for themselves, and none of them are adequate. You know, it's not good that there's no agriculture. So we develop agriculture. That's order. Well, that's good. That's helpful, but that's not, that's not finality. It's not good for people to be alone. Well, so we establish community. Community brings some order. Great, but that's not the end of it. What about city life? What about the arts of civilization? What about et cetera, all the way through? Genesis 1 through 11 is this story of people seeking order and finding it inadequate. And that very appropriately dumps you into chapter 12, where now we find that God's proposal for order for humanity is covenant, which features relationship with God on his terms and features God's presence, the temple eventually, the tabernacle, the temple, dwelling among them. And so we find that chapters 1 through 11 drive us right into 12 through 50. And so this idea of order bringing is the key theme, not sin and salvation. Those are later themes, they're important themes, but they're not in Genesis. So that's just a quick resume. By the way, lots of that information was developed by my son, who did his doctoral dissertation on this topic. And he influenced me in many ways. And again, some of his work is in this book.
Oh, that's so nice. Father and son working together. uh, I myself, with a son with 20 years old, I am starting to have this experience, and I must imagine how exciting must be this. And we are very excited. I was already very excited with this interview, and now bringing up some new material, some brand new material here to Brazil. First hand material. I'm very excited, and that's so nice, Edrei, right? Professor Walton,
Yeah.
You took us all the way from Genesis 1 to Genesis 12, and I like it I like so much. This you said, uh, be image bearer is being an image bearer is being an order bringer. A bringer. I'll remember this. I'll not forget about this. But still, in this narrative from Genesis 1 to 11, uh, going to chapter 6 and 7 and 8 and 9, how do you understand the scope of the flood in the book of Genesis? Does the text necessarily require a global reading, or does it allow for a regional understanding within the worldview of the ancient Near East?
I think the flood narrative conveys to us a universal perspective, but a universal perspective in terms of humanity. That is, all people were only evil all the time. Every inclination of the heart was only evil all the time. That comes before the flood story in Genesis 6. It comes after the story in Genesis 8. And that reflects, of course, the total collapse of order. That when people try to bring order themselves, well, it just goes the other direction because we're all greedy and selfish. And so it just goes the other direction and things get worse and worse. Now, one of the considerations that people might have is that, well, if we only started all over, things would be better. Okay, even theologians have raised that time out of mind. That is, why didn't God just kind of wipe out Adam and Eve and start again? Or even with Moses, God says to Moses, "I'll start all over with you." And we often have this thought: if we could only get a take two, get a second try, it could be better. And that's really what the flood represents. Okay, will a second try work? If we started all over, would it make a difference in this universal human nature? And of course, when we see the verses at the beginning of the account and at the end, we see, no, it didn't make any difference at all. Even though he's starting with this guy who was the best of the best. He walked with God, he was blameless in his ways. Even starting over with the best of the best, nope, didn't solve the problem. Because even the best of the best choose their own way. All we like sheep have gone astray. Each one of us turned to our own way. Isaiah says it eloquently. So the scope of the flood narrative is supposed to be reflecting the universal human nature, not so much a universal geological, hydrological event. And that's where we have to understand how it fits in the flow of the narrative. So that's kind of how I would see the flood story. It's considering another option for whether order can be established by humans. And the basic point is starting over won't help.
Okay, so in this topic, we need to ask about the way that people, how did ancient Near Eastern peoples typically use universal language such as the whole earth or all peoples in their historical and religious narratives?
So we can see examples in the ancient world. I mean, one very well-known one is when Sargon describes himself as having conquered all the lands under all the heavens. Well, he got as far as the top of the Euphrates, maybe. There's still an awful lot so that universalistic language, we find it in conquest accounts, one of the most evident places to find it. But more importantly, I mean, we have that, but more importantly is whether we find that kind of universal rhetoric in biblical texts. And of course, yes, we do. And we talked about this at some length in The Lost World of the Flood. That is, we have many examples in the Bible where universalistic language is used, particularly in connection to chaos and destruction and disasters, when we know that it's not universal in scope. So when Genesis 41:57 says, all the world came to Joseph for food, all the world was in famine, we don't really think that people came across the Atlantic in their canoes. We know that wasn't what was going on. Uh, and and people don't have any trouble with that. They read Genesis 41 and they make the adjustment to the rhetorical language just fine. I think really one of the more interesting ones is Zephaniah 1, because in Zephaniah 1, it's the destruction of all humanity and all animals and just massive total destruction using universal language. But we know that Zephaniah is describing the exile. We know that plenty of Israelites survived, as well as lots of other people, and there are lots of animals. Yeah, I mean, but there we see this rhetoric of universal language. Now, it's important to note that doesn't prove that the flood account is using this universal language rhetorically. It only shows that it might be, that would be very common usage. Um, Still, somebody might say, well, yeah, sure, lots of times the universal language is rhetorical, but here it's not. Okay? Uh, how can you prove it? But,
Arbitrary.
but by showing that there are many other places where it is rhetorical, that opens up another alternative. You can't say the Bible demands a global flood. Nope, there's another option on the table, which is a very viable one and defensible. So, in that sense, when we look at both the rhetoric in the ancient world in their texts, as well as the rhetoric in the Bible, we can see that we've got another option besides thinking that there was a global flood.
Oh, that's very good. This universal rhetoric, this hyperbolic rhetoric, is also very useful to understand the Canaanite question.
Yes.
Going to Joshua and all, but it's not here in your topic, but
Yeah.
that's very, very, very useful. But going a little bit deep in the flood, if you can say that, in your view.
Diving deeper
Diving
into
in
the
the
flood
flood.
waters.
Diving in the flood water is very good. In your view, what role does ancient cosmology play in interpreting the waters of the deep, the windows of heaven, and the destruction described in the flood narrative?
Well, as we might imagine, when the Israelites talk about the world around them, they use their own familiar concepts and ideas. Everybody in the ancient world, including the Israelites, believed there was a solid sky. They all believed the earth was basically a disk. They all believed in pillars that somehow held up the earth. And this is terminology that we see in the Bible, that we see in the rest of the ancient world. And uh, things like windows of heaven assume that kind of backdrop, waters of the deep. So they're using their own cosmology terminology. And that's because when God communicated to and through them, he very willingly accommodated their views of the cosmos. That wasn't to try to preach it as this is the way everybody has to think about the cosmos. Solid sky, you got to believe it if you believe the Bible. Not at all. It's just he accommodates his message to adopt the perspectives that they had to get across the important points. There's a great book by John Hilber on that about cosmology in the ancient world, and I highly recommend it. He talks about this whole idea of accommodation and relevance theory in terms of how we communicate to one another and assuming familiar ground.
So about this familiar ground and the relationship of this flood narrative and other texts of the ancient Near East literature, we have the Epic of Gilgamesh and the Atrahasis. Okay, so is the primary facts of the flood narrative the geographical stand of the event or the teleological message conveyed by the text? And how do you understand the relationship between the biblical flood account and texts such as the Epic of Gilgamesh and the Atrahasis?
Okay, so probably the most famous document of the ancient world was the Epic of Gilgamesh. We know that because of the hundreds and hundreds of copies that have been found of it all over the place, including in Israel. So Israelites, and that, by the way, was Judges period. Israelites, even before David, knew well the Gilgamesh epic. The Gilgamesh epic itself is a reflexive rendition of the Atrahasis epic, which came earlier, and both of them have a flood account in them. Um, there's no surprise that we should find flood accounts across the ancient world. By the way, there are none in Egypt. That's interesting. But at any rate, it's no surprise that we should find them because we assume there's some kind of massive event. Even if we can't describe it scientifically, there's some kind of massive event that would be reflected in the literature. But what's most important is that even though there are reflections of this event in the various cultures, Babylonian and Israelite, for example, even though there are reflections of this event, they have different interpretations of it. And that's what matters. When we talk about the Bible, it's not events that are inspired, it's text that is inspired. At least that's what Paul tells us in Timothy. Okay, it's the text, the graphe, that's inspired, not events. And so it's not our job to reconstruct events. It's our job to understand the narrator's interpretation of the event, which we believe came from God. Okay, and so when we look at those ancient Babylonian documents, they have a very different interpretation, and it's one that we reject entirely. But yet, the fact that they can refer to the same event shouldn't be a problem. That doesn't mean that the Israelites had to kind of copy the mythology of Babylon. These are events that people know about. and they have their interpretations of what took place. So you're absolutely correct. The focus of the flood narrative is not geography or hydrology or the extent of the flood. Rather, it's the impact of the flood theologically. This was a devastating event, whether it's at a local level or a regional level or whatever. It was a totally devastating event. And the question certainly arises, what in the world are the gods doing? And the Babylonians had one understanding of that as they gave a reason for the flood. And the biblical author has a very, very different explanation. And that's what counts. That's what matters.
Oh, that's so nice. Uh, Even if you try to start again, the things would go wrong. And I think that it's very interesting to see that theological interpretation of this massive event that took place in the ancient Near East. Uh, and the theological interpretation is the things went too bad, and that's the consequence of our own choices. But even if we want to start again by our own, the things won't be better. So that's a great lesson that I took from already from our conversation here. And I was trying to reach a book here in my shelf, but I remember that it's in my Kindle. So you also have a book called The Lost Word of the Prophets. So
Mm-hmm.
we can go to the prophets a little bit right now. And I would like to ask you, how did the prophets of the Old Testament use symbols, hyperbole? We talked about a little about this, and cosmic imagery to communicate their messages.
Mm-hmm. Any type of literature that wants to make use of symbolic kind of imagery is going to draw on those things that are familiar to that world. Otherwise, they're not going to communicate. And so it's no surprise that the prophets use such um, analogies, metaphors, illustrations, and they're all tied to that known world because they're trying to communicate. Um, Sometimes there is hyperbole in the sense of how massive the destruction is going to be. Again, going back to Zephaniah 1 is a great example of that. Um, but cosmic imagery, these are the commonalities. They're actually used more often in apocalyptic literature than in prophetic literature. And I see those two as having some overlap, but yet being very different genres. But of course, apocalyptic uses those things even more so. So they use them to communicate meaningfully. Just like a pastor today might start his sermon with an illustration, a story to connect with his audience, and then use that as the basis for moving into the point of the message. It's just an effective way to communicate.
Very good. Professor Walton, you don't think about writing a book with the title The Lost Word of Apocalypse? It will be The Lost Word of Revelation or of Apocalypse, talking about the apocalyptic literature. It will be so nice. It just occurred to me while I was hearing you. But Edrei will continue with another question.
Well,
I
they
was just kidding. But if
uh,
No
if
problem.
you have this intention, we will be very glad to hear.
well the Lost Word of the Prophets has several chapters on apocalyptic. So it actually the title says Lost World of the prophetic and apocalyptic. It's got both of them in it. So I did talk about some of that. And of course, the commentary on Daniel does a whole lot more with it.
Yeah, that's right. I I didn't I didn't read yet. I didn't read yet the Lost Word of the Prophets in Portuguese, but now I'm gonna do that, and I'm
Yeah.
very excited to to see this commentary of yours about Daniel. So, Edric, please.
So thank you. Still in this lost road of prophets, let me ask you about to what extent were the prophets speaking to their immediate historic context and to what extent were their message point toward the future realities? And this question was make my dad is a pastor here in Brazil, Everton Valente, his name, and he is a great admirer of your work, Professor Walton. So it's a pleasure to me to speak with you because my dad teach me to like you. So let, let me do this question by my dad here.
Sure. So um, the prophets are spokespersons. They speak for God. And that role involves explaining the past, explaining the present, and talking about the future. So we shouldn't think of them as just focused on the future. They have as much to say about the past and the present as they do about the future. They also, besides being spokespersons for Yahweh, they also are, we could call them guardians of the covenant or champions of the covenant. Almost everything they have to say is relative to the covenant. And so they'll talk about how the people are being unfaithful to the covenant. They'll call them back to the covenant. They will urge them to get rid of those things which are problems to the covenant. But when they turn to the future, they're talking about how the people are bringing the covenant curses on themselves. Those covenant curses were articulated back in Deuteronomy and Leviticus, and they talked about all these things that would happen. And so the prophets are invoking that. They're saying, these are the kinds of things God said was going to happen if you were unfaithful. And sure enough, look at what's coming. And so when they talk about the future, sometimes they're talking about judgment that's connected to the covenant curses. They also talk about the future when they want to assure the people that God's not giving up on you. Even though God is punishing you, he's bringing judgment, he's bringing these covenant curses, it's not over. There's restoration coming. And so he looks to the future there. And he doesn't always give them a very clear idea of what restoration is going to look like. And as we know, it often didn't end up the way they thought it would. That's true of the return after the exile. It's true of their messianic expectations. We know that the Jewish people of Jesus' day were very surprised by the kind of Messiah that he was. And so when it looks to future realities, it's looking in fairly general terms that can take shape any number of different ways. And we don't know how long it might be, what process. Daniel, of course, found out that even though the exile ended after 70 years, Israel was not yet free of empire. And that was going to take a lot longer. That's if you preach the 70 weeks next week. And so the way the future unfolded was somewhat surprising. But by talking about the future, the idea was to give them hope and to give them motivation to be more faithful to the covenant. So it's not as if God's kind of peeling back the veil to give you a glimpse of tomorrow's headlines. It's rather that he's giving them reason for hope, reason for trust, reason for response. The prophecies often focused on their immediate historical context because the main thing the prophets wanted was response. You're not going to get a response by all kinds of cryptic hidden messages that people don't understand and that aren't going to happen for centuries. You get response by showing them the negative effects of their behavior, and how God still has good things for them. So I think I would say that they are speaking to their immediate historical context. That doesn't mean that there's no implications for the future, but it's not for us to figure out the implications for the future. So we have to take that into account.
Not like a code hidden there for us to to break.
Right.
I remember something that I learned reading your books, that the Bible is for us, but it's not written. It's not have been written for us. And when we see the prophets, that works very, 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 very well for us to understand the prophets, and that's very nice. And still in this topic, how does the knowledge of ancient Near Eastern literature and culture help in interpreting difficult prophetic texts, perhaps helping us to understand a little bit more of the historical background and context and so on?
Yes, that happens both on the large scale and the smaller scale. On the large scale, just to understand how this kind of literature worked in the ancient world can be helpful. It can help you avoid making mistakes. For instance, we find in the ancient world and in the Bible too that a judgment oracle is not necessarily a guarantee that that's going to happen. We take Jonah. Jonah says 40 days you're going to be destroyed. It didn't happen because people responded. And we find that's true in the ancient Near Eastern literature as well, that these judgment oracles were talking about this is the direction you're heading. This is where this behavior leads. It's not too late to change it. This is the way it could look, and you can do something about it. So understanding the larger literature and culture is a helpful thing. On specific issues, sure, it's always helpful to get some situational information. One of the things I like is in the first vision in Zechariah chapter 1, he's shown a myrtle grove, and there's horsemen coming into the myrtle grove, and there's a conversation with the angel of the Lord, and the angel of the Lord asks for a report from the horsemen who have been going to and fro around the world, and they say, the world is at peace. And he says, oh no! You say, what's going on here? I don't get it. That seems like it should be a good thing. But then when you dig into the date of that oracle and what's going on at the time, of course, the Israelites have been under Persian rule. And at the date of that oracle, there's chaos on the throne. The king has died, Cambyses, and there's a scramble for the throne because he didn't have an established successor. And so all of the conquered territories were thinking the empire is going to collapse and we're going to have freedom again. The empire is over. But what happened was Darius I came in and solidified things. He took the throne, and so everything was made peaceful, no longer any chaos or struggle within the Persian monarchy. So when he says all is at peace, it's, oh no, the empire is going to continue. We're still under foreign rule. That's not going to change. And that's, of course, when the message comes that God is still zealous for his people Israel. Yes, you're still under empire. It didn't collapse. It looked like it was gonna. Didn't collapse. But God's still working. So that's a great example where you really kind of need to know the historical situation before you can really understand what's going on there.
So we see many people here in Brazil and all places of the world in a preacher's church speaking about the Old Testament and the books of prophets, with a view of New Testament, with an image of New Testament in his mind. So, for example, when they read Isaiah, Zechariah, they have scatologic impressions about these texts, but not the image of eschatology way of Israel people, but the Christian view. So they have the figures as new creation and restoration and chaos, judgment, new exodus, that all these texts of prophetic literature have. So how do you understand the prophets' use of themes and terms such as chaos, judgment, new creation, and restoration, peace, and other things like that?
Well, here we have to talk about the issue of fulfillment. And one of the things I do in the Lost World of the Prophets is I draw a sharp distinction between the message of the prophet and the fulfillment of the prophecy. We have to see them as different things, but lots of people in the church do not. They think prophecy is all about fulfillment, and they only quick look to what's the fulfillment going to look like. And I think that that fails to do justice to the prophetic message. The Israelites, the audience of the prophets, understood the message. The prophets generally gave 4 different types of oracles. They gave indictment oracles. Here's what you're doing wrong. The Israelites knew what that meant. Here's what's going to happen. The Israelites understood the force of that. Here's what you need to do instead, instruction. The Israelites could receive that. And God still has hope for you. And the Israelites could respond to that. The Israelites know precisely what the message is. And that's what carries the authority of the prophet. He's got a message. Now, both in ancient Israel and today, we believe that lots of those messages found fulfillment. Fulfillment is the unpacking, the unfolding of events. And with the unfolding of events, people can start to connect dots. So here's the prophecy, it said this, and now we just saw this happen, and oh, I can connect those dots and see this as fulfillment. And the New Testament authors do this at times. Lots of times, of course, it's a very unexpected dot. It's not the kind of thing that you would have thought would happen. But the hindsight of the New Testament authors and the inspiration that they received helps them to identify fulfillment. So identifying fulfillment becomes the message of the New Testament author. That fulfillment is not in the message of the Old Testament author. It's rather how the New Testament author is connecting dots under the influence of the Holy Spirit. So what happens, however, is we sometimes in the church today try to take our lead from the New Testament authors and start trying to read the Old Testament as eschatology, looking for fulfillment. And we start to think we see dots to connect. We'll experience events and we'll say, oh, here's a dot I can connect to an Old Testament prophecy. This is fulfillment. And most of the time we're wrong. And it's not the kind of thing that we can do with any kind of certainty. You know, how many dozens, hundreds of people have been identified as the Antichrist over the centuries of Christian history? You know, we're trying to connect dots. And so lots of times when we are looking at these themes that you mentioned, chaos, judgment, new exodus, new creation, sometimes those are dots that the New Testament has connected for us. And that gives us new insight from those New Testament authors. But lots of other times we're trying to do our own dot connecting. And that has a lot more uncertainty connected to it.
Yeah, we can say that Jesus had the authority to connect the dots, and also the apostles because of the
Right,
authority he. But we don't
right.
have this authority, so if
Yeah,
we try to connect the dots, especially if with our own time, we're gonna fail, right?
yeah.
And going to this idea of fulfillment in the New Testament, um, how did the Second Temple Judaism shape the way Scripture was interpreted in the time of Jesus of Nazareth? what interpretative methods were common among Jews of that period, and how do you understand that New Testament? Oh, you already said that the how the New Testament authors use the Old Testament in this concept of fulfillment, but we can start to think about a little bit of how the Jews and so Jesus and the apostles interpreted the Old Testament in the Second Temple Judaism. So this can help us to understand how this fulfillment was seen in Jesus himself. I think that it may be worthwhile to talk a little bit about this now, if you can, please.
Sure. So earlier in the podcast, I talked about backpacks. You know, that we've got ideas in our backpack and we've got pieces of literature that are familiar to us and our audience that we're interacting with. And those frame our conversations. Those give direction and focus to our to what we write, to what we talk about. So if we kind of just start working backwards, you know, Calvin had a backpack. His backpack was not the same as ours. There were issues in the time of the Reformation that he wanted to address. There were major voices that he wanted to interact with. There were ideas and concepts on the table that framed how he talked about these things. And you keep going back, Aquinas had a backpack that represented his day and what was going on. Go back to Augustine. Augustine has a backpack. There's the Arian controversy. There's the Pelagian controversy. There's the developments of the creeds that are taking place in the 4th century. There's all of the political developments with Constantine. And so all these writers are doing theology, but they're doing it from their own backpacks of the issues and literature of their day. Now, I don't get a lot of argument about those things. This is kind of a evident way to think, but let's push it back. Paul had a backpack. Paul had issues of his day. He had conversation partners of his day. Paul was very well aware of the book of Enoch, of the book of Jubilees. He was very well aware of Seneca and the Stoicism. He was very well aware with Philo and his philosophy. Paul had the same kind of Pharisaic training that Josephus had. So when we read Josephus, even though he's after Paul, we can see the kinds of things that Paul would have been taught and that Paul would have thought. We can see who he's in conversation with. And so Paul is influenced by his backpack, by the conversations of his day, because all of those writers, all of those ideas in those writers are all in his backpack. He's having conversations with Hillel and Shammai. He's having conversations with the Jewish thinkers of his day, Yohanan ben Zakkai. So we have to put them in their context. But also, this gets even more tricky, Jesus had a backpack. He was divine, but he was human. And in his humanity, he was interacting. You know, it's fun to think. I can't prove this at all. But when Jesus was 12 years old and ended up in the temple discussing with the teachers, if the teachers there refers to the Sanhedrin, and it could, the lead of the Sanhedrin at that time was Hillel, and the vice president of the Sanhedrin was Shammai. And the possibility that Jesus could be sitting there having conversations as a 12-year-old with the great rabbinic teachers, Hillel and Shammai. Jesus is working in a world. And it's true of the New Testament authors. And so we shouldn't be surprised that their thoughts are tailored to the conversations that are current in their world. And those aren't always the conversations that are current in our world. And so in that sense, you know, when we think about Second Temple Judaism, of course it had to shape the way Scripture was being interpreted, because that's the world they live in. Those are the conversations they're having. And no surprise that they would use some of the same methods of interpretation that were familiar to that world.
Professor Walton, your work has been admirable because although it's highly academic, it has reached many people thanks to your charismatic and didactic way of teaching. If the common evangelical mindset seems to be gradually gaining a better understanding of the inspiration of the Word of God through you and your work. And in my home, I have the example of my dad, as I said early on, who used to be a radical literalist regarding the text of Genesis, but who also had many difficulties uh, to understand certain issues and problems there. But through your work, he find great response, a great answer to this question, and he has today a correct vision to see Genesis, or at last so close at that. So let me, let me ask you, how would you recommend to modern readers approach the Old Testament while respect its original context? And what's the relationship between ancient cultural context and divine inspiration? And what advice would you give to students and readers who want to interpret the Bible more faithfully to the ancient world and the intentions of the biblical authors?
So I have a book that's fairly recent. I don't think it's in Portuguese yet. It's called Wisdom
Yes,
for Faithful Reading. And there I talk about lots of principles for interpreting the Old Testament to be faithful to what the authors are intending, and ways we can think through some of these issues, both cultural and literary and linguistic, all of those ways. So the whole idea with that is that our responsibility, if we want to be faithful readers, our responsibility is to track with the authors, because that's where the authority of God's word is. He put it in the authors, he communicated through those authors, and therefore, if we're going to get God's message, we have to be tracking with the authors, not kind of doing our own thing. So if we're going to track with the authors, we need to understand any cultural aspects of their communication. Again, this goes back to what I said at the beginning, that culture is a silent partner in every conversation. And therefore, if we're going to understand what the authors are saying, sometimes we need to understand something about their culture that is not obvious to us and not familiar to us. And so, in that way, our uh, our ability to pay attention to the ancient context actually reflects our belief in inspiration. That is, that the source of this material is God, but that he worked, we call it dual agency, divine agency, human agency, that God worked through humans, and that's how his message was conveyed. So if that's how inspiration took place, that's how interpretation ought to take place. That's how we're going to respect the inspiration of the text, by actually being able to think the way that the authors were thinking in terms of what they communicated. And sometimes that just requires us to understand the culture a little bit better. Because again, they're communicating to insiders who they assume know their culture and share their culture, and we don't. So that's how ancient cultural context and divine inspiration work together. Um, in terms of how to go about being more faithful readers, again, that's what I wrote that book, Wisdom for Faithful Reading, for, to try to show that in all kinds of different ways. So there are about 15 chapters of general introduction and ideas and principles, and then I go through Pentateuch and historical literature, narrative, through wisdom literature, through prophets, and so each one giving principles for interpretation. So my advice is to, first of all, adopt a framework, a mental state that you want to understand what the authors are saying. I don't want to read as an American, as a United States person. I want to read as an Israelite. People in Brazil probably eventually want to read like Brazilians. That's fine, but first, read like an Israelite. Because reading like an Israelite is going to get us that inspired message, that authoritative message, that then we can take to our readings when we read as a Brazilian or a United States person. So in that sense, that's my advice, a commitment to tracking with the authors.
Very good. Before I read as a Brazilian, I must first read as an Israeli, so I can understand better the text. And this way, bring the text to my Brazilian context. That's a little bit what I've been trying to do, inclusive as a pastor, when I preach the Word of God. And Professor Walton, here in Brazil, that's my last question. I don't know if Edrei would have another one, but here in Brazil, people are often very impressed by deep knowledge of the Bible. So I can imagine that a lot of people would watch this interview and say, "Wow, how Professor Walton knows the Bible. That's very impressive." Even when I preach, sometimes I receive this kind of feedback. But eventually, everything comes down to one question: the devotional implications, at least here in Brazil. So, seeking for this wisdom for the readers that you mentioned, that in your recent book, people want to know what to do with all of that. In your opinion, what benefits can a deeper understanding of the Old Testament as ancient Near Eastern literature bring to someone's devotional life? I must say that I was very edified hearing you here. But how can someone put all these things, bring all these things to his devotional life is an important issue for readers and listeners and viewers here in Brazil. What do you have to say about that?
So there's a section on this in the Wisdom for Faithful Reading book. And what I draw a contrast. When we're reading the Old Testament especially, we encounter the Old Testament in what I call bits. It might be a verse, it might be a passage, it might be a devotional. We encounter it in small portions. And because we take the Bible seriously, because we respect it, because we want God's message, we're often faced with the question, what do I do with the bits? It might be a proverb, it might be a psalm, it might be a Bible story, it might be a law. What do I do with the bits? And I think lots of times when Christians are reading the Old Testament, that confuses them because some of them are pretty easy, but lots of them are not. And what am I supposed to do with the bits? Our inclination is that we try to take each bit and say, each bit has authority. Each bit is the word of God. And so each bit I want to drop into what I call the me box. It's about me, my issues, my path in life, my journey, my spiritual growth, my finding the will of God, my causes, my agendas, right, the me box. And they think that they can take each bit and figure out something significant in the me box. But to do that, they have to make a lot of stuff up. They often isolate that bit from its context. They often don't understand something culturally or historically or even theologically behind that bit because they haven't paid attention to the larger context. And so that's an inclination that so many Christians have when they read the Bible. So I have an alternative to suggest. When we encounter the bits, we shouldn't be trying to drop each one into the me box. Rather, I would say we should be pushing them up into what I call the God box. The God box works under the premise that the Bible is being written for us to understand God's story, to understand his plans and purposes, and how he has worked them out over the course of time and history. We're supposed to be seeing God at work, After all, it's not Abraham's story, it's God's story. It's not Esther's story, it's God's story. Not Daniel's or Ruth's or David's, it's God's story. And all of those are the characters that we see God working through them and in them. Sometimes they do well, sometimes they don't do so well. But with each of those stories, with each psalm, with each proverb, we're supposed to be pushing up. How does this help me understand the God box? Because I believe that's what the authors are doing. They are giving us God's story. They are giving us God's plans and purposes. And so if we're doing that, if we're pushing it up into the God box, then the question we're asking is my response, the relevance, what does it mean to me, is found in how I become a participant in God's plans and purposes. What am I supposed to be doing to enter God's story? I don't want to drag him into my story. I want to enter his story. I want to participate in his plans and purposes. And so the God box is constantly being fueled by all the little bits. It's not each bit that gives us a way to participate, but it's the growing profile that's being built, book after book after book. And that profile helps us to know how we can think about God working in the world. How does he do what he does? He doesn't do it the same all the time. Okay, so we can't have guarantees. This is how he's going to work for me. He did this for Abraham. He did it for Daniel. He'll do it for me. Well, maybe, maybe not. Okay, but we can see his track record. One of the examples I use of that is that lots of us these days have facial recognition stuff, programs on our phones or our laptops or things like that. And I've been told by people who program that kind of stuff that every time your device pings your face, it improves its internal profile of your face. Always adjusting, always revising, always making it better. And the more times that your device has pinged your face, the better it is, the more precise it is, the harder it would be to fool. And so when I think about us reading the Bible, I'm thinking about us pinging the face of God. Every time we open the pages, it's one more ping, one more ping, one more ping. And we're using that to build a profile of how God works in the world, how he works through people, good ones or bad ones, and what his plans and purposes are. And when I ask, what does this matter to me? It's not based on the bit, it's based on the profile that's being fed by the bits. And the result is that I'll have a better idea of who God is and how I can relate to him and how I can be a participant. Ancient Near Eastern literature helps with that because it helps us sort out the bits so that we can feed them up into the God box in appropriate ways instead of inappropriate ways.
Wow, what a great analogy. Build a profile based on every time we see God through a bit. And that's very important, what you just said. Maybe people in Brazil would like to remember that. Take the bits out of your me box and put them in the God box to start to see the profile, to picture the profile. Oh, that's how as I said before. I've been very edified with this interview. It's not only a lot of knowledge and a lot of wisdom, but also something that came right to my heart. So I am very thankful for this opportunity. I don't know if Edrei wants to make another question. He mentioned something to me in the chat, but
Oh,
I don't know. Edrei, you have the
I don't
word.
have more. I'm just thankful. I'm very thankful for you, Dr. John Walton, for your availability to speak us about the Old Testament and the ancient Near East literature and the importance of these understand to our devotional life and our understand of God and His profile. So thank you, God bless you, and we see you again in other times.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you very much. A last word of yours, Dr. Walton, for Brazil, please.
Yes.
What do you have to say for Brazilians who wants to read more, understand better the Bible, say something to Brazilians. Your last words, please.
We should all be committed to being faithful readers. We try to be right, but we won't always be right. I won't always be right. I've changed my mind on some things, so clearly I'm not always right. And so it's not about being right, although we should do our best, but it's about being faithful. Faithful to what we have, faithful to the knowledge we have, faithful to the resources we have, and to be faithful to God. And the way we do that is by focusing on that which has authority, which we receive by tracking with the authors. And of course, that's why ancient literature is so important, because it helps us to do that. But it also involves careful work in understanding words, understanding literature. So it's a commitment we should have. So tracking with the author and pinging the face of God.
Oh, very good. Thank you. Thank you so very much.
Thank you.
It's been great being with you.